My name is Ann Clements, and this is Gospel Tangents.
It's the best source for Mormon history, science, and theology. I'm Rick Bennett. Gospel Tangents is supported by users like you. Please support us at gospeltangents.com or on Patreon. I'm excited to have Ann Clements on the show. She's the author of one of the chapters in Secret Covenants, New Insights into Mormon Polygamy, and we're going to be giving away a free copy of this book that's autographed by Ann, Cheryl Bruno, and Claire Barris to one of you. So go to gospeltangents.com/contest, and you could win this book right here. In our next conversation with Ann, we're going to talk about the Clift sisters who married, three of them did anyway, married Theodore Turley. So Ann is a descendant of Theodore Turley. Also, Rick Turley is a descendant as well. We'll find out more about that relationship here. And we're going to talk about these three Clift sisters who married Theodore Turley. The first story we're going to talk about is an amazing story about surrogate motherhood. Did you know that happened in the 1830s in England? So it's an amazing conversation, a very strange story that Ann's uncovered. So you won't want to miss this conversation. Check it out. Welcome to Gospel Tangents. I'm excited to have a repeat guest here on Gospel Tangents. Could you go ahead and tell us who you are? And you've written a chapter in a new book. Tell us about that.
I have. So my name is Ann Clements, and I've appeared on here before talking about Nauvoo counterfeiting. This time I've written a chapter in the book, Secret Covenants, New Insights on Early Mormon Polygamy, specifically about my ancestor and his three wives that were sisters that were early Nauvoo polygamists.
Yes, and so it was a great chapter. It was, can I say, kind of mind-blowing for me? So the other really cool thing is Ann brought an extra copy of this, and we are going to be giving away a copy. Now, one of the cool things about Secret Covenants is a different author wrote almost every chapter. I think Don Bradley contributed to 2.
Yes.
And so I'm going to get you to sign your chapter, and then we'll see. I'm also going to have Claire Barris on, and he's going to talk about his chapter. And I'm just going to try to get Brian Tensmeyer, Don Bradley, hopefully Cheryl Bruno will talk to me. Mm-hmm. And we'll talk about a lot of these different chapters. And so we'll dive mostly into your chapter, but I'll probably hit you with some other questions too as well. So there was a rumor that Theodore Turley, and by the way, you and Rick Turley are cousins, right?
We are. We are half-third cousins.
Half-third cousins?
Yes.
From different wives or something? Is that how it works? Okay. So Theodore Turley was reported to be one of the earliest polygamists. You've uncovered that, well, he still is early, but he's not as early as some people thought.
Right. And it's partly because of the way that the family was recorded. So later family members actually kind of backdated the marriage based on the birth of a child, which when you look into the actual historical records, it was a child of someone else. And so, but they just assumed it was Theodore's child, partly because of how it was recorded.
Right. But it's a crazy story too.
It is a crazy story. But as a result, family members understandably thought that this was one of Theodore's children, so they must have been married, more than 9 months previous to this kid's birth.
Which was like 1842 or so, right?
Yeah, so they assumed it was before January of 1842, which would have made him the earliest polygamist besides Joseph Smith. And a lot of people believed it until
you uncovered the work that...
No, actually it was Gary Bergera who first uncovered it.
Okay.
Yeah. In a dialogue article about the early Nauvoo polygamists. So he had recognized that this wife, Mary Clift, was involved in some high council proceedings about adultery. And so he recognized that the baby this baby was declared the son of another guy. And so he devised... Not Theodore. And so he figured out early on, he's like, the family probably backdated it, in order to hide the illegitimacy. It's possible that was a motive, but I also think based on the way that Mary Clift approached polygamy, it adjusted the way that Theodore Turley recorded her children And it made it so that it appeared that it really was Theodore's child. And that kind of goes into just the different perspectives on polygamy that each of these three women had.
Yeah, they were sisters, right?
They were three sisters, yep.
Very biblical names, Mary, Sarah, and Eliza.
Eliza, yep.
Yeah, so let's... It's strange enough that he married three sisters, right? And there was a wife before that, right?
Yeah. His first wife, he'd already been married for 20 years to his first wife, and they had 10 kids together. So, wow. So these were three sisters that he married in Nauvoo. So I don't know where you want me to...
Let's go back because now are you certified genealogist now?
I am. I actually have an official credential. Wow. I am a certified genealogist.
And we should remind people that you have an archaeology degree from...
I do have a bachelor's in archaeology from BYU.
Okay. So, and you are... I may be biased, but can I say one of the best researchers I know?
I'll take it. Oh, good.
So me and Marianne, we blog at Wheat and Tares, and she has this great story about the guy with the wooden leg who walked all the way to the Salt Lake Temple from Alpine, which is like 30 miles, or ridiculous, and you found out that story is not really true. Mm-hmm. He probably hitchhiked on the horse or something.
He did hitchhike, but most importantly, the wooden leg came just shortly before his death. So he had both functioning legs while he was working on the Salt Lake Temple. So, he could have walked, but he wasn't walking with a wooden leg. That's really the key element.
It's a great article. I'm going to link to it. Yeah. So it just shows what a thorough researcher you are, and so you use your. Is the archaeology helpful to your genealogy?
Actually, it really was. In fact, that was my first exposure to the BYU Family History Library.
Okay.
And I don't know if we've already talked about this, but...
we can remind people. They probably haven't seen the first interview. But they'll go back and watch it.
Yeah, they'll go back and watch it. So I was working for the Office of Public Archaeology at BYU, and we were analyzing a bunch of artifacts that got dug up during the tracks, when they were installing tracks along 4th South. And one of the artifacts that got dug up was actually a headstone. And so it was my job to figure out who this headstone belonged to, because we had the inscription, but they hadn't found a body with it or anything. And so I actually had to go up to the BYU Family History Center and learn how to go through microfilm, learn how to go through census records, and eventually I found the obituary of this guy. He lived in Park City. He was an old miner. It was actually kind of cool. So one thing with archaeology is that when you analyze, you have to look at the geology of the area. You have to look at the history of everyone who's lived there. So you learn very quickly you kind of have to become a little bit of an expert in everything in order to write up your final report. And so I also analyzed, there was a whole cache of bottles, like beer bottles and wine bottles and whiskey bottles. And so I had to learn how to tell the difference, because the Salt Lake Brewery was right there.
Oh.
And so it was this place that obviously they threw all the broken glass, because back in the day they would recycle the bottles. And so in order to get more beer, you would bring the empty bottles, and then that way they had something to put it in, because they didn't have a glass manufacturing area out west, right? So they were having to reuse it. So anyway, they had uncovered this huge cache of glass bottles that had been used for various types of alcoholic beverages. And so I had to examine them, figure out what kind of bottles they were, and I learned that different types of alcohol have different types of finishes, meaning like the very top of the bottle. Whiskey finishes are different from champagne finishes, which are different from like beer bottle finishes. And also I would look for, the manufacturing symbols, usually on the bottom of the bottle. And so I had to, research where were these companies and when were they in business, because that could help us kind of identify a time period. And so, just random things like if you're finding, dishes and they have a manufacturer's mark, you have to figure out, okay, what company was that? How long were they in business? Whenever we did surveys, especially like on old mines, you'd come across cans, you'd come across coffee cans, you'd come across sardine cans, you'd come across just all these different types of things. And you'd have to learn, okay, like, where can I find out about this company? Where can I? And so so we were learning early on, like how to research online, how to find the books where we could find information. So absolutely, it helped teach me how to do research on random areas. Like, okay, I've got to suddenly figure out geology. How do I figure out the geology of this place? Okay, let's work on that. So
yeah, well, very good.
Absolutely helped.
So let's dive into England. Well, because to me, I think Sarah was the most interesting story because she was a surrogate mother.
She was, and hers was the hardest story to figure out.
It's the craziest story.
It is the craziest story. And it took me, I began working on this project about 10 years ago. With my work with the Theodore Turley Family Organization.
Former president, right?
I am a former president, yes. I'm still currently the webmaster. In back late 2013, 2014, when I first was getting involved with it, someone had mentioned that Theodore Turley had a wife buried in the Salt Lake City Cemetery that didn't have a headstone. And so people were like, okay, well, who can look into that? Because we would love to raise money to put a headstone, because that seems really weird that she wouldn't have had one and we wouldn't have been aware of that. So I went in, and it was Mary Clift. But in the records that I was looking at, sometimes it was Mary, sometimes it was Mary Ann, and someone named Mary Ann, I wanted to make this right before we put it on a headstone, right? Put it in stone. And so I started looking into Mary Clift's history. And that's what got me looking into all three of these sisters. And so we did, just as a heads up, we did raise enough money, and we got a headstone put in for her and another Turley family member that was buried right next to her.
Okay, so Theodore had a first wife.
Okay, so Theodore was a native of Birmingham, England, or Birmingham. Sorry, apologies if I'm not pronouncing it correctly. Birmingham. And he married Frances Kimberly first in 1821.
Okay.
He was a metal worker. They lived for a few years in Birmingham, then moved to London, but eventually they moved over to Canada. And it was when he was living in Canada that they both got introduced to the missionaries.
By Elijah Abel?
Not by Elijah Abel. No, by Elder Isaac Russell was the one that actually baptized them. And then Theodore did a lot of preaching himself in the area of the Canada. So he has a lot of history up there.
Okay. And then he ends up in Nauvoo.
Well, he comes down to Far West.
Far West, okay.
Just before everything, all heck breaks loose. And he's actually part of the Committee on Removal. But then he ends up going to Nauvoo. He's actually the first Latter-day Saint to construct a home in Nauvoo. It was just like this little wood cabin. Like, it was literally logs and stone is how he describes it. And he had to finish that because then he was going to go on a mission with the 12 apostles to England. And so in September, he and a bunch of other guys, Wilford Woodruff, Brigham Young, they all left to go on the mission to England. And it was on the mission to England that he probably didn't know the Clift family very well. It was actually Wilford Woodruff who went to Herefordshire and was the one who baptized members of the Clift family. But Theodore Turley led the group back in late 1840, and that included Mary Clift and James Clift, her little brother. And that's probably how he got really acquainted with the Clift family, was because he was the one heading up the ship coming back.
Okay. Is that one of the... Are there any famous ships from England, or was this just one of many?
It was just one of many. It was not the first, I think, of that group to come, but it was one of the earliest. Theodore Turley had to get out of England because he had served some time in prison there during his mission, served a couple months in prison. Because
of counterfeiting? No, just kidding.
Not counterfeiting. Okay, so originally when he left Birmingham, he had partnered with another guy. Birmingham was like close to the industrial capital of the world, like manufacturing galore, right? All these, and so he had learned very specific metalworking techniques. He was technically stamper, piercer, and toolmaker, and which later comes in handy with the counterfeiting later.
Exactly. That's
So
why I said
yeah.
that.
So anyway, he had the skills.
Because I knew he tied into our previous interview as well a little
Exactly. So, but he had gone into business with another guy who was not a metal worker, but he was probably financially backing the business. And then we have record that the partnership was dissolved and Theodore Turley agreed to take on all the debts. It's just that shortly, like a year or two after that, he moved to London. And then eventually he moved to Canada. So when he comes back in 1840 and starts preaching in England, he's preaching actually very close to his home in near Birmingham, so Warwickshire, Staffordshire. There are some people who are actually pretty angry at him for preaching. And so it's a combo of he probably still had some outstanding debts, and there were some people who really wanted him to stop preaching. And so it looks like they probably dug up some dirt on him and came and figured out that he owed money, and so then he got put in Stafford prison.
In debtor's prison, basically.
He got put in a debtor's prison, right. And so he eventually, I think he was able to work with his brother to help come to an agreement with his previous partner. But based on how he was arrested, the fact that he wasn't arrested in Birmingham, he was arrested in the next county over and put in jail in that county, even though that's not where the offense would have come from. It probably was a combo of people wanting to stop him from preaching, but also there may have been something to it, because it does seem like his brother did have to come to an agreement and exchange some money with the partner.
And so after he got arrested, did he just flee to...
No, so he actually served a couple months in the debtor's prison, which he had to have food brought in from the church members. So a lot of the church members were helping him out, visiting him. I don't think he had food for like the first several days because no one knew what was going on. And so, but then after that, he gets out in, I want to say May. And then later on, as they're going through, they decide it's probably best if he goes back to America. And in fact, when he leads this group, I believe they leave England around September. When he leads this group, he's not listed on the passenger manifest. They didn't want people to tie him to it, is what most people think, is why he wasn't listed on the passenger manifest.
So
but William
probably
Clayton,
under a pseudonym or something?
I don't know. I don't think it was a pseudonym, but William Clayton was in the same group, and William Clayton was the one, he wrote every single day, like in his journal, the entire account. And it's very clear from Clayton's journal and from other letters that were written that this was Theodore Turley's group, that he was coming back.
Okay. So this is 1840 or so?
1840, yeah.
Okay, so he heads back to America with Mary Clift, one of the three
Mary Clift
sisters.
is one of the three sisters. So
and she must be 20 years younger than him or so, probably?
Yeah, she was in her mid to late 20s.
And so he's in his 40s? Okay.
Yeah. So he was 39, 40. He was born in 1801.
Okay.
So we need to go back and like talk about the Clift family, how they joined the church.
Yeah. This is where it gets crazy.
So the older daughters, all three of the girls that we're going to talk about, were born in Bristol, which is actually a port town. But at some point, the family decides that they're going to move up north to this really tiny farming area. And so it's right on the northern edge of Gloucestershire, and it's right next to what they call a market town, which is a slightly bigger town where everything happened. It was called Ledbury, and it was technically in the county of Herefordshire. So we're in this little, sometimes they would call it the three counties area, where Worcestershire, I think it was Worcestershire, Herefordshire, and Gloucestershire all met. And so it can get really confusing because they're all considered different conferences. They're all considered, like, as far as church conferences, it's all based on the counties, but everyone's talking to each other. Everyone's, interacting with each other. So the family moves up there. Robert Clift, who's the dad, he is like a gardener. So that may have been why they moved to an agriculture area. They were definitely on the poor end. Mary Clift, when she's coming over on the ship manifest, she describes herself as a servant. So these are definitely lower working class people. before they encounter missionaries, this is where we get Sarah.
Yes, this is the story.
This is the story. So the family had 8 kids, 5 of whom survived to adulthood.
5 Clifts,
right? And so we have these 3 sisters, and then they have 2 brothers, Robert Clift Jr., James Clift. So before the church comes into the picture, what appears to happen is that Sarah Clift becomes acquainted with a doctor who worked in Ledbury at the Ledbury dispensary. It was basically a hospital. It was a healthcare clinic, but specifically for people who were poor, indigent. And so, as near as we can tell, she became acquainted with this doctor, and she probably started working for him. Sometime in about 1838, it appears that they came to some sort of surrogacy arrangement. So he had married his first cousin back early 1820s, and they hadn't had any kids yet.
This is the doctor.
This is the doctor, Dr. Congreve Selwyn. He'd married his first cousin, Albinia Selwyn. So,
Wow.
Selwyn family, this becomes important. So he was local. The family was well known in that Ledbury area, even
and marrying
though
first cousins wasn't a big deal then?
it was British aristocracy. It wasn't a huge deal. But their home was in Cheltenham. But it was clear that he worked a lot in Ledbury, which was right next to their home in Dimmock at the top of Gloucestershire. So she has a baby boy, and
Who's she?
Sarah Ellen Clift has a baby boy named Congreve Selwyn.
Okay.
And we know this because Theodore Turley recorded, and he basically created a family group sheet for Sarah Ellen Clift. And he recorded the names of 2 boys that she had with the last name Selwyn. He doesn't record that there was any sort of marriage that occurred, but he records these 2 boys and he gives their exact birth dates.
Okay, so let's make sure we're here. So Sarah works for Dr. Selwyn.
Sarah works for Dr.
And then
Selwyn,
comes-
and then she has a baby.
But because Dr. Selwyn and his cousin/wife couldn't conceive?
As far as we can tell, they hadn't had any kids and they'd been married for 15 years.
Okay, so is this is conjecture that he said, "Hey, would you be my surrogate mother?
It
'Cause
is
my wife can't
conjecture
conceive?"
because there's no other explanation for this. This was, so we know that
let
this.
me ask you this: could it have just been an affair with the secretary?
It could have been an affair with the secretary. What's weird is that he takes the kid in, he legitimizes the kid, and the kid lives with him for the rest of the time. And the kid is known as the son of Congreve Selwyn and his wife, Albinia.
So nobody knows that Sarah's the true mother. So they
We
just
don't know
adopt him
if
in.
people knew, but what we do know is we know the name of this kid, we know his birth date, and it matches the kid that Dr. Selwyn had in his household. And the only reason that I am fairly sure that it was some sort of surrogacy arrangement is because there is no birth registration for this boy, either as Sarah Ellen Clift's son or as Congreve Selwyn's son. Birth registrations began in 1837 in England. All births were required to be registered.
And this is 1838?
This is 1839 now.
39.
The baby was actually born in 1839. And that was something I was like, oh, this will be easy. I'll be able to tell who the dad is based on the birth registration. There was no birth registration under Sarah. And I was like,
So they were just doing this on the sly, it sounds like?
as far as we can tell, yes. Because then I was like, well, okay, let me find the birth registration for this son of this prominent aristocratic couple, because obviously they would have registered the birth of their own son, right? No birth registration for this kid. So I'm like, okay, what are the chances that we have a kid who matches the exact same age, who matches the exact same name, which Congreve is not a common name there, and what are the chances that these are 2 different kids?
So this is Congreve Jr.,
Congreve Jr.,
okay.
son of Congreve Sr., who remains in England. His parents are listed as Congreve, as far as we can tell,
Okay.
but there's no birth registration for him.
See, the reason I'm asking you this is because I have a neighbor who's she's a genealogy major
Yeah.
from BYU. and one of my good friends, and I said, because after I read your chapter, I was like, Jana, have you heard of surrogacy arrangements in the 1830s? And she said no. She said there were lots of illegitimate births
Absolutely.
all over England.
Yes.
That was very common for
That
the
was
day.
absolutely common.
And so that's why my question is...
But they didn't usually take the dad's last name. They usually kept the mom's last name.
And so
because
this
they were
is why you
illegitimate.
think they probably had an arrangement.
The fact that the birth wasn't recorded, because you have illegitimate births and they're recorded all the time.
Oh,
The birth was not recorded, which means they did not want people to know that Sarah was the mother. They did not want, because you have to declare, someone who was present for the birth has to declare that they saw this mother have this child. And the only reason why you would not have a birth registration either as Albinia as the mother or as Sarah as the mother is they didn't want people to know the circumstances of the birth.
okay. So that's why you think it was basically
That's
a
why I
surrogacy.
think it was a
'Cause-
surrogacy arrangement, and the fact that a second boy is born with the same surname.
Okay.
So that's not the only boy she has. She has 2 boys.
Okay. So you think she did this multiple times with the same doctor. So that would give credence to the idea that this must have been arranged.
Yes,
I mean,
one kid I could totally understand as an affair. Like, absolutely. But again, the kid would still be registered.
So the second
as a
kid
birth.
wasn't registered either?
Correct. The second kid, born in 1841, wasn't registered either.
Oh, wow.
And his name was George Augustus Selwyn, who was a prominent name in the family. So both of these kids were given prominent names in the Selwyn family. Congreve, after his dad. George Augustus Selwyn, one of their more famous relatives. So they're given these highfalutin names, and she records these names. She has, when she comes over, Theodore Turley records these names, records their exact birth dates. Neither one of them have birth registrations in England.
So the first one was born in 39. The second
39.
one was born in...
41, beginning of 41.
Okay.
So
So by now, Mary, Sarah's sister, has already come to Nauvoo with Theodore Turley.
Yep. So Mary and James had already left England by that point.
James is the...
Her younger brother.
Okay.
Mary was the first of the family to be baptized. James was baptized the next day. He was the youngest. And they were the first to go to America. Their other family members, their parents were baptized just a couple months later, but they don't leave for America until the early part of 1841, which is shortly after, within a month or so after Sarah has this second little boy, George Augustus Selwyn.
And so does she come at that time too?
She appears to come at that point.
And so she takes the younger son with her.
She takes the younger son with
leaves
her.
Leaves the older son.
So when she shows up, there's a census in Nauvoo that was taken at the end of 41, beginning of 42. When she shows up, she goes by the name of Sarah Ellen Selwyn, and she has the son, George Augustus Selwyn.
So Congreve Selwyn
Remained
never married
behind.
Sarah Selwyn, but she took his name to...
In Nauvoo, she went by the name Selwyn because she had a son named Selwyn, George Augustus Selwyn. So the family always
But there's
figured
never
she
been
married
any-
a guy named Selwyn.
Okay, so it's not like Congreve was a polygamist in England.
No,
Okay. So she
there's
took
no
his
marriage
name.
record.
There's no marriage record. It
She-
just seems so weird to split the one kid. But maybe that was more common back in the day.
No, it wasn't. The reason why they had to, or the reason why she probably was able to take the younger kid is because the bastardy laws. It was a very weird period where in 1834, and then they changed them again in 1843. They were really mad that there were so many illegitimate kids. So in 1834, they changed the laws so that women would be the only ones responsible for illegitimate kids, for their kids. The father had no responsibility. It was not required at all. The father had no claim on that illegitimate child. And that was different. Prior to 1834, there was this expectation that the father would be able to that the father would provide at least some support. There was this expectation that if the dad wanted to claim that kid as his own, he would be able to take that kid as his own. But these kids were born at a time when Dr. Congreve Selwyn would have had absolutely no claim on these illegitimate kids if the true nature of their birth were known.
Okay. Well, and I also wondered, the second child would have probably been nursing, I would say, right?
Absolutely, yeah.
And so that would
he
be
was
another
only like
reason
a
to
few
keep
weeks
him with
old.
her.
Yeah, and so, but at the same time, especially if there had been any sort of financial transaction, they would have wanted to keep that baby. However, if she threatened exposure, she would have been able to take both kids with her. So I think that she was able to use that as leverage to be able to take that younger baby, because they had a son, they could raise. And if she told everyone what had actually happened, she would be able to take both of the sons, because that dad did not have any right to those kids because they were illegitimate.
Okay.
And that was a unique aspect of the bastardy laws between 1834 and 1843. They changed them because they thought that would, force women to be more responsible about not allowing themselves to be used and having illegitimate children. The idea was if they punished women more, then women wouldn't have as many illegitimate children.
But it didn't work out.
It didn't work out. And it was very clear that it was not working out. And so they changed the laws again so that the dad was responsible. And so that's the other reason why suddenly, if this arrangement had happened outside of that, he would have been able to claim the kids and easily just, recognize them as legitimate and just take them. But because of that weird, and I didn't even know about these bastardy laws until when I had submitted the
laws?
Yeah,
because that's a terrible name today.
It is a terrible name, and I normally wouldn't say that word, but that's actually what they're referred to.
I guess it was just common.
And so it was, when I submitted my chapter, it was actually John Hatch that came back. And he was like, why do you think they allowed her to take the younger boy? Because initially I was like, well, because he was nursing and they probably felt bad for her or whatever. But then I was thinking about it and I'm like, no, if they had had some sort of financial arrangement, they probably felt that boy was theirs. And so I started looking into the laws with illegitimacy because I wasn't finding anything on surrogacy. Nothing. No one was mentioning anything about it. But then when I started figuring out that those boys were born at a time when the biological father had no claim on illegitimate children, the mother had sole responsibility, sole claim, and so and it was meant to punish the women. It was meant to punish the women,
which it did.
Which it did, and that's why I think they had to keep it so quiet, because if it was known that these were her illegitimate children, she would have had full claim on them.
Okay.
The doctor would have not been able to claim them.
So Congreve in Albania never had any other children.
They never had any other children. So they just ended up
raising Congreve Jr. Mm-hmm. And
and in fact, it's actually kind of tragic because both Congreve and Albania died fairly soon after. Oh. And so he actually, he grew up kind of by more, trying to think. So he was raised more by other people. He wasn't really raised by his parents because they died when he was younger.
Okay.
And then he became a minister like his grandpa. His grandpa was also a Congreve Selwyn. So that was a Reverend Selwyn. So he became another Reverend Congreve Selwyn.
So he was Congreve the Third.
Mm-hmm. And then he married another girl that was of high aristocratic status, but they never had any kids. So otherwise, we would be able to at least do DNA tests to be able to confirm that this is the right guy.
Does he know? So Congreve probably didn't know that his mother was Sarah Clift?
I have no idea if he knew. Yeah. Because he would have only been 2 years old when she left. Okay. So I don't know that they ever would have told her. My assumption is she probably was the nursemaid and she probably would have helped with raising the boys. But I don't know that he ever would have known. I actually checked his will because I was curious if because if they had told him, maybe they would have told him that he had a brother in America, right? So I was wondering, I knew he didn't have any kids. I was curious if he would leave anything, but he just left everything to his wife. So no clues there.
Okay.
And then they never had any kids. He ended up dying at a relatively young age as well. So
The third?
The third, yeah.
Okay.
I think he was in his 40s, but it was still way too young.
Okay.
But yeah, so that's kind of a dead end. So we can't do DNA to prove that he was in fact.
We'll get Ugo Perego. I'm sure he won't mind.
We'll dig him up. Yeah.
He'll find relatives.
It wouldn't be the first time. Yeah. But
we don't always have to dig him up.
but the only reason that we were able to tie this boy is this boy did not have a birth registration. But in Nauvoo, at some point, Theodore Turley was basically writing family group sheets for his first wife and then for two of his plural wives, two of these sisters. And on the one for Sarah Ellen Clift, it gave explicit names, although instead of Congreve Selwyn, it was Congreve Clift Selwyn. And then the next boy was George Augustus Clift Selwyn. And it gave their exact birth dates and birthplaces. So like we had exact information about this. Neither one of those boys were ever registered in England.
Okay. So, all right.
And also George Augustus Selwyn never went by Clift. He never had that middle name Clift. And the other guy, Congreve Selwyn, never went by that name. So it was clear that that was inserted for that family group sheet, which means Sarah wanted to lay claim to those kids. And that's another thing that made me think that like, she's viewing this polygamy thing. She is making sure he is recording these as her two boys. But honestly, that matters because her sister, Mary, she recorded her illegitimate boy and there's no indication that he had a different father. With Sarah, there's no indication they had a father at all. It doesn't mention that she was married to anyone.
Okay. I hope you enjoyed our conversation with Ann Clements. She's the author of one of the chapters in Secret Covenants, and I'm going to be giving away a free copy of this book, autographed copy, to one of you. So go to gospeltangents.com/contest and sign up to win an autographed copy of this book. In our next conversation, we're going to talk about some of the other sisters that married Theodore Turley.
That is April of 1844, so before Joseph Smith's death.
Okay.
It is April 1844. And then there's this cryptic little thing kind of at the bottom where like, I think it indicates that he probably married Mary Clift on the same day. But that one's a little bit more conjecture but there's definitely this really weird little cryptic thing where it's like you have the first letter and then ... and another first letter ... And it really looks like.
Thanks for listening, and I hope you to continue to enjoy Gospel Tangents. Consider becoming a Patreon or go to gospeltangents.com/shop, and you can get a cool tie, a hat, or even a nice mug. You can also get a sweatshirt. So check it out at gospeltangents.com/shop.